America's death row. Isolation as a sentence. Death row in the United States is not defined by executions. It is defined by isolation. Before the needle, before the warrant, before the witnesses gather behind glass, there is a far longer punishment that begins immediately after sentencing. It starts the moment the courtroom empties and the condemned is transferred away from the general prison population. From that moment forward, the individual is no longer part of the prison system in the traditional sense. They are placed into a separate category, legally alive, administratively finished. Death row is not a place of rehabilitation. It is not designed for reintegration or correction. Its primary function is containment while the legal system moves at its own pace. That pace can stretch into decades. For most inmates sentenced to death in America, execution is not imminent. Waiting is. The geography of death row. Death row does not exist in one location. It is spread across multiple states, each with its own facilities, policies, and legal frameworks. Yet despite these differences, death row units across the country share striking similarities in structure and intent. They are usually housed in separate buildings, isolated wings, segregated tiers. In many prisons, death row is physically distant from general population units. The design is intentional. Reduced movement lowers security risks and simplifies management. But the result is near total separation from normal prison life. Cells are typically single occupancy. Not as a privilege, but as a control mechanism. The space is minimal. Concrete walls. Steel doors. Narrow windows, if any. Lighting is artificial and often constant. The environment is designed to be observable, predictable, and sterile. There is no personalization beyond what regulations allow. No posters. No open shelves. No shared living space. The message is clear: this is not a place meant to feel lived in. Isolation is not an accident. Solitary confinement is often discussed as a disciplinary measure. On death row, it is standard procedure. Most death row inmates spend between 22 and 24 hours per day inside their cells. Recreation, when allowed, occurs alone or in closely monitored cages. Social interaction is limited to brief encounters with staff or conversations shouted through walls. This level of isolation is not imposed because of misconduct. It is imposed because of status. Administrators justify the practice by citing security concerns, risk of escape, legal liability, management efficiency. But the effect on inmates is consistent regardless of justification. Human beings deteriorate without social contact. Time without structure. In general population, prisoners have routines. Work assignments. Programs. Scheduled interactions. These provide structure, however limited. On death row, structure collapses. There are no jobs. No education programs. No vocational training. Religious services are often conducted cell to cell rather than in congregate settings. Recreation schedules are sparse and inconsistent. Days blend together. Weeks lose distinction. Years pass without markers. Time becomes something measured not by calendars, but by legal filings, mail delivery, and the occasional movement down a corridor. Many inmates report losing track of seasons entirely. Artificial lighting replaces sunlight. Temperature is controlled centrally. The environment does not change, even as decades pass. This absence of progression creates psychological stagnation. Mental health under prolonged isolation. Psychologists have long documented the effects of extended isolation. Death row provides one of the longest sustained examples of this condition in modern institutions. Common effects include chronic anxiety, depression, cognitive decline, emotional numbness, Hallucinations in severe cases. The uncertainty of execution amplifies these effects. Unlike life sentences, death row inmates live with an unresolved endpoint. They do not know if or when they will be executed. This uncertainty produces a specific psychological strain. Hope exists, but it is unstable. Despair arrives quietly. Courts have debated whether prolonged death row confinement constitutes cruel punishment. The debate continues. The conditions remain unchanged. Contact with the outside world. Visits on death row are tightly controlled. Physical contact is often prohibited or heavily restricted. Conversations occur through glass partitions or monitored rooms. Visits are limited in frequency and duration. Mail becomes the primary form of outside connection. Letters arrive irregularly. Legal correspondence dominates personal communication. For some inmates, family contact fades over time. Distance, stigma, and emotional exhaustion reduce visits. Years pass. Relationships dissolve. Death row narrows the world until it consists of a cell, a corridor, and a legal process that moves slowly and impersonally. Staff and the culture of detachment. Correctional officers assigned to death row are trained to maintain distance. Emotional involvement is discouraged. Professionalism is defined by neutrality. Many officers rotate off death row assignments due to stress. Others remain for years and develop coping mechanisms rooted in detachment. Conversations are brief. Interactions are procedural. Names are often replaced by identification numbers. This is not cruelty by design. It is emotional self-preservation. The institution treats death row as a system to be managed, not a population to be engaged. The illusion of imminence. Public perception often imagines death row as a countdown to execution. In reality, most death row inmates will wait 15 to 25 years or more. Appeals are mandatory. Legal processes are slow. Execution dates are frequently delayed or overturned. Some inmates die of natural causes before their sentence is carried out. Others have their convictions reversed after decades. Death row is not a conveyor belt. It is a holding pattern. The punishment is not just death. It is living indefinitely with the possibility of it. Isolation as the first sentence. Before execution is even legally possible, isolation has already taken effect. It is not imposed after appeals fail. It begins immediately after sentencing. The system does not wait to punish. It separates first, decides later. For some inmates, this isolation lasts longer than the prison terms of people convicted of multiple violent crimes. It is a punishment that functions independently of execution. Waiting, appeals, time, and legal limbo. Death row is sustained by waiting. Once isolation is established, once routine has collapsed into repetition, the sentence enters its longest and most defining phase. This is not the period of execution. This is the period of uncertainty, the legal suspension that can last decades, where nothing moves quickly, nothing ends cleanly, and nothing feels final. Waiting on death row is not passive. It is structured, procedural, and relentless. Every day is shaped by a system designed to move cautiously, not compassionately. The law advances slowly because the stakes are absolute. But for those inside the cells, that slowness becomes its own punishment. Why waiting exists? The modern American death penalty is built around the assumption that mistakes are possible. Because execution is irreversible, the legal system mandates layers of review. Appeals are not optional in capital cases. They are automatic. From the moment a death sentence is issued, the case enters a process that is designed to outlast the initial trial by many years. This process includes direct appeal to the state's highest court, state post-conviction review, federal habeas corpus petitions, additional discretionary appeals, Each stage examines different aspects of the case. Some focus on procedural errors. Others analyze constitutional claims. None promise relief. They promise scrutiny. The law does not rush toward execution. It circles it. Time as a legal tool. The appeals process is often described as a safeguard. In practice, it is also a delay mechanism. Cases move slowly because courts are overloaded, filings are complex, and standards of review are strict. A single appeal can take years to resolve. A denial may come with little explanation beyond legal citations. During this time, the inmate remains confined in death row conditions. No improvement in housing. No increased privileges. No reduction in isolation. Time does not soften the sentence. It stretches it. For many inmates, the waiting period exceeds the length of a life sentence. People sentenced to life without parole may have more daily freedom than someone sentenced to death. Waiting becomes the sentence's dominant feature. Legal hope and legal exhaustion. Death row inmates quickly learn that hope is procedural. It arrives in the form of filings, briefs, and court dates. It disappears in short orders denying relief. The cycle repeats. Some inmates become deeply familiar with legal language. They study case law. They memorize precedents. They track Supreme Court decisions because a single ruling could affect their case. Others disengage. The complexity becomes overwhelming. Legal language feels distant and impersonal. Appeals become reminders of how little control they have. Both responses are common. Neither changes the outcome. Waiting does not guarantee justice. It guarantees duration. Execution dates and their fragility. When an execution date is finally set, it is rarely final. Execution dates are often followed by emergency filings, requests for stays, competency evaluations, last-minute evidence claims. Some executions are halted days before the scheduled time. Others are stopped hours before. A few are stopped minutes before. This creates a pattern of anticipation and collapse. For inmates, the setting of an execution date does not end waiting. It intensifies it. They prepare for death while knowing it may not come, yet. Psychological effects of prolonged uncertainty. Waiting under threat of execution produces a distinct psychological condition. Unlike ordinary incarceration, death row waiting involves an unresolved endpoint. The inmate cannot plan for the future because the future may legally not exist. Common effects include chronic hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, emotional flattening, difficulty maintaining relationships. Some inmates describe becoming numb. Others describe oscillating between hope and despair depending on legal developments. The system does not account for this instability. It records behavior. It tracks compliance. It does not treat waiting as trauma. False certainty and late discoveries. One of the most uncomfortable realities of death row waiting is that it occasionally reveals errors. DNA testing, witness recantations, and newly uncovered evidence have led to exonerations, sometimes after decades on death row. These cases demonstrate why waiting exists, but they also expose its cruelty. An inmate may spend 20 years in isolation only to be released. The system acknowledges the mistake. The time is not returned. Other inmates are not exonerated, but their sentences are reduced. Death becomes life without parole. The waiting ends, but the damage remains. Waiting does not discriminate between the innocent and the guilty. It affects all equally. Families waiting on both sides. Waiting extends beyond prison walls. Families of death row inmates wait for appeals, updates, and outcomes they cannot control. Visits are limited. Communication is restricted. The stigma of the sentence isolates them socially. Victims' families also wait. For many, the appeals process prolongs grief. Execution dates come and go. Closure is promised but deferred. The legal system places both groups into a cycle of anticipation without resolution. Waiting creates no winners. Aging on death row. Because waiting lasts so long, death row populations age. Inmates sentenced in their 20s may reach their 50s or 60s before their cases conclude. Chronic illness becomes common. Mobility declines. Cognitive impairments emerge. Courts must then evaluate whether an aging inmate is competent for execution. These evaluations add new delays, new filings, and new ethical debates. Waiting turns death row into something unintended, a geriatric ward with an execution chamber. The illusion of movement. From the outside, death row appears active. Cases move through courts. Headlines announce rulings. Dates are set. Inside the cell, nothing changes. The bed remains bolted. The light remains on. The door remains locked. Legal movement does not translate into physical movement. Appeals do not improve conditions. Progress in court does not ease isolation. Waiting is invisible to the public but constant for the inmate. When waiting becomes the punishment. At some point, waiting overtakes execution as the dominant experience. For inmates who have spent decades on death row, the execution, if it occurs at all, becomes almost abstract. The daily reality is survival inside a static environment. The punishment shifts from death to duration. The law may define the sentence as execution. The lived experience defines it as indefinite suspension. The machinery of the final sentence. If isolation is the foundation of death row, and waiting is its duration, then procedure is its engine. Execution in the United States is not an emotional event within the system. It is not spontaneous, and it is not driven by passion or vengeance. It is carried out through written policy, administrative checklists, and legal authorization. By the time the state prepares to execute someone, the process has already consumed years, often decades, of legal and institutional effort. Execution is not the beginning of punishment. It is the endpoint of a system that has already done most of its work. When the law decides waiting is over, an execution cannot proceed unless every required legal step has been exhausted or waived. Courts must confirm that no appeals are pending, no stays are active, and no unresolved claims remain. Once this threshold is met, the state requests authorization to carry out the sentence. Depending on jurisdiction, this may involve a court-issued death warrant, an order from a governor, administrative scheduling by corrections authorities. The issuance of this authorization marks a shift. The case is no longer moving through courts. It is moving through the prison. This transition is subtle but absolute. The shift inside the prison. Once an execution date is scheduled, prison operations change around the inmate. They are usually transferred from their standard death row cell to a pre-execution holding unit, often referred to informally as death watch. This unit is closer to the execution chamber and designed for constant monitoring. Surveillance increases. Movements are logged meticulously. Every interaction is documented. This is not because the inmate is suddenly more dangerous. It is because the state must ensure the execution occurs as scheduled. The system becomes focused on prevention, not of escape, but of disruption. The purpose of Death Watch. Death Watch exists to ensure that the inmate survives long enough to be executed. Self-harm before execution is treated as institutional failure. The state does not allow death to occur outside its authorized process. In Death Watch, cells are monitored continuously. Lights may remain on at all times. Personal items are restricted. Observation logs are maintained at short intervals. This environment is more controlled than ordinary death row confinement. Privacy is reduced further. Autonomy disappears almost entirely. The inmate's body becomes evidence the state is preserving for a scheduled event. Final legal activity. Even at this stage, legal activity does not stop completely. Defense attorneys may file emergency motions challenging mental competency, execution protocols, newly discovered evidence, constitutional claims. Courts often review these filings under extreme time pressure. Judges may issue rulings late at night or hours before the scheduled execution. Some executions are halted at this stage. Others proceed. The legal system does not promise certainty. It promises opportunity for review, witnesses and transparency. Executions in the United States are conducted under observation. Witnesses typically include representatives of the victim's family, media witnesses, legal officials, prison administrators. The condemned inmate may request witnesses, often family members or spiritual advisors, subject to approval. Witnesses are not present to intervene. They are present to observe. The state frames this practice as transparency. The execution is not hidden, but it is tightly controlled. No recordings are permitted. No photographs are allowed. The event is documented, not shared. Execution methods and policy. The method of execution depends on state law. While lethal injection is the most common method today, alternatives remain authorized in some jurisdictions. Execution protocols are written in detail. They specify drug types and dosages, personnel roles, timing procedures, emergency contingencies. These protocols have changed repeatedly over time, often in response to legal challenges or drug availability issues. The state does not innovate. It adapts. Medical involvement and ethical boundaries. Execution protocols often involve medical personnel, though their roles are limited and controversial. Professional medical organizations generally prohibit participation in executions. As a result, states may rely on anonymous contractors, non-physician medical staff, correctional personnel trained in insertion. This has created ongoing legal and ethical disputes. Courts have allowed the practice to continue as long as constitutional standards are met. Medicine becomes a tool of procedure, not care. Final statements. Most states allow the condemned inmate the option to make a final statement. This is not mandatory. Final statements vary widely. Some express remorse. Some maintain innocence. Some address victims' families. Some choose silence. The statement is recorded verbatim. It is not debated or challenged. This moment is often framed publicly as closure. Within the system, it is treated as a formality. The execution itself. The execution chamber is designed for efficiency and observation. Witnesses view the procedure through glass. Staff operate equipment from controlled areas. Communication follows protocol, not emotion. There is no commentary during the process. Commands are procedural. The environment is quiet. Once the protocol is complete, a designated official confirms death based on established criteria. The time is recorded. The sentence is carried out. After the sentence is fulfilled. After death is pronounced. Witnesses are escorted out. Documentation is completed. The body is released according to prior arrangements. The prison resumes normal operations. Staff rotate assignments. The execution chamber is secured. The institution does not pause. It records and continues. The impact on staff. Correctional staff involved in executions are trained to maintain professional distance. Psychological support varies by institution and is often limited. Some staff report long-term emotional effects. Others compartmentalize the experience as part of their duties. The system does not publicly acknowledge staff impact. The execution is treated as a completed task. What the machinery reveals. Execution is often imagined as the central act of capital punishment. In reality, it is the shortest part of the process. Years of isolation precede it. Decades of waiting surround it. The machinery exists to ensure that execution occurs within the bounds of law, not morality. It does not ask whether death should happen. It asks whether it is authorized. Decline, doubt, and the future of the final sentence. Death row in the United States was built for permanence. Its architects assumed the system would endure, that executions would continue steadily, and that capital punishment would remain a central feature of American justice. That assumption no longer holds. Today, death row still exists, but it does so in a state of contraction. Fewer people are sentenced to death. Fewer executions are carried out. More cases linger unresolved. The system has not collapsed, but it has slowed under the weight of legal, moral, and practical doubt. The final sentence remains legal in many states. Its future, however, is increasingly uncertain. A system in retreat. At the height of capital punishment in the late 20th century, death row populations expanded rapidly. Executions increased, and death sentences were handed down with relative frequency. Since then, the trend has reversed. Several developments have driven this shift. Declining public support for the death penalty. Increased awareness of wrongful convictions. Rising costs of capital litigation. Judicial scrutiny of execution methods. Legislative abolition in multiple states. Death row populations have shrunk. Some states retain the death penalty on the books but rarely, if ever, carry out executions. Others have eliminated it entirely. The system still functions, but it no longer dominates. The cost of finality. Capital punishment is expensive. This reality has become increasingly difficult for states to ignore. Death penalty cases require lengthy trials, extensive jury selection, expert witnesses, mandatory appeals lasting decades. Studies consistently show that pursuing the death penalty costs significantly more than sentencing someone to life without parole. Even when executions are carried out, the financial burden remains high. For states facing budget constraints, the question has shifted from morality to efficiency. Many have concluded that the cost of execution outweighs its perceived benefits. Justice, in practice, must be funded. The problem of error. No issue has reshaped the death penalty debate more than wrongful convictions. Since the modern era of capital punishment began, dozens of death row inmates have been exonerated, some after spending decades in isolation. DNA evidence, recanted testimony, and newly uncovered misconduct have revealed flaws that the system failed to catch early. These cases do not suggest the system always fails. They prove that it sometimes does. And in a system where punishment is irreversible, sometimes is enough to undermine certainty. Every exoneration weakens the claim that the death penalty can be administered without fatal error. An aging death row. As executions slow, death row populations age. Many inmates sentenced in the 1980s and 1990s are now elderly. Chronic illness, physical decline, and cognitive impairment are common. Courts increasingly face cases involving inmates who no longer resemble the individuals who committed their crimes decades earlier. This raises difficult questions. Does execution serve a purpose when an inmate is incapacitated by age or illness? Can someone who no longer understands their punishment be executed? Should the state expend resources executing prisoners who may die naturally first? These questions add legal complexity and further delay. Death row becomes less about punishment and more about prolonged containment. Mental competency and ethical limits. U.S. law prohibits executing inmates who lack the mental capacity to understand their punishment or the reason for it. This protection has introduced new ethical dilemmas. In some cases, inmates develop severe mental illness or neurological conditions while on death row. Courts must then determine whether treatment to restore competency is appropriate, especially when the only purpose of treatment would be to make execution possible. This creates a contradiction. Treatment is meant to heal. Execution negates the value of healing. Courts have struggled to reconcile this tension. The result is further delay and uncertainty. Public opinion and cultural change. Public support for the death penalty has declined significantly over the past several decades. While opinions vary by region and political ideology, the overall trend is clear. Younger generations are less supportive than older ones. Media coverage of exonerations and execution controversies has shifted perceptions. The death penalty is no longer viewed as an unquestioned response to violent crime. Support still exists, particularly in the aftermath of high-profile cases. But it is no longer dominant. Capital punishment has become a contested policy rather than a settled one. Victims' families and the burden of delay. One of the strongest arguments against the death penalty comes not from defendants, but from victims' families. Many families report that prolonged appeals prolong their grief. Execution dates are announced, stayed, and rescheduled. Closure is promised but deferred. Some families support abolition, arguing that life without parole provides certainty without decades of legal turmoil. Others continue to support execution, believing it represents justice fulfilled. The system offers no resolution that satisfies everyone. International isolation. The United States now stands apart from most developed nations in retaining the death penalty. Many countries have abolished capital punishment entirely or refuse to cooperate with extraditions that could result in execution. While international opinion does not dictate U.S. law, it influences global perception. Capital punishment has become an American anomaly rather than a global norm. This isolation adds pressure to a system already under scrutiny. What death row has become? Death row was designed to carry out finality. What it has become instead is a prolonged holding system. It holds people sentenced under past political climates. Legal contradictions the system cannot resolve quickly. Moral debates the nation has not settled. Executions still occur, but they are rarer. Death row increasingly resembles a permanent state of suspension rather than a pathway to completion. Possible futures. The future of death row is not singular. Several outcomes are possible. Continued decline in death sentences. Additional states abolishing capital punishment. Death row units closing or shrinking. Executions becoming increasingly rare and contested. Some states may retain the death penalty symbolically while abandoning it in practice. Others may eliminate it entirely. The system may not end dramatically. It may simply fade. The final reality. Death row was built on certainty, the belief that some crimes demand death and that the system could deliver it accurately and justly. Time has introduced doubt. Doubt about fairness. Doubt about accuracy. Doubt about necessity. Isolation remains. Waiting continues. The final sentence still exists. But the confidence that once sustained death row has eroded. What remains is a system caught between law and conscience, moving forward slowly because it is no longer sure of where it should end.